Hi, I'm Sam Peterson, nearly award-winning author of Trunky, Transgender Junkie, and the soon-to-be published Sugar, a memoir of craving. I've struggled with depression, anxiety, and PTSD, along with a penchant for drugs and alcohol most of my life. Thanks to the love and support of dear friends, intensive therapy, good meds, and some sobriety, I'm a lot better now, but I still struggle. So I wanted to ask people who have been through it, what keeps you going? What did you go through? Why do you stick around? How are you today? So I'd like to invite you to listen in on my journey as I ask Durham, North Carolina based actor and producer Thaddeus Allen Edwards, why live? Well, yeah, I guess you and I have known each other for a while now. I have, kind of stand you over the years and have seen all your shows, and you're an actor. You do a lot of performing here in the Triangle,
Yeah.
and you're an amazing performer. And every time I have a project like this, I always invite you to be a part of it because you're energetic. The way that you think is very interesting to me, and yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you, have a conversation with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to it.
2020 came and my mom died. I lost my best friend, or my a very dear friend of mine died like days later, and I lost my job. And then COVID hit. I just found myself riding this tsunami of grief and loss, and then there were no people around, but I still, the question still arose for me, like, well, why live? Like, this is because I've survived a lot, and I'm sure you have too. And
Yeah, I think that for me, what resonates in that is the fact that I was like formally diagnosed with depression like maybe 5 years ago, I think.
oh yeah,
But it was definitely it was like oh like that's the word for what my adult life has felt like.
yeah,
you know, and also like coming from a family where mental illness has been sort of like a tributary of a certain branch of my family. uh the depression and anxiety, I think, has always been just there's the image of like the dark cloud, but it's really just more of a miasma, really, that
hmm
that walking through. um but I also acknowledge that, like, for me, what what I've always had is just a curiosity for what tomorrow brings,
ah,
whatever that tomorrow is, right? Like, I just want to know what happens tomorrow.
yes. Yeah, that's funny because if I could condense the question why live into a single answer, it would be because I want to know what happens tomorrow. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's it. We're done. It's really true though. Like yeah, I want to know what's going to happen. And
Yeah.
yeah, so you're kind of a newbie to this depression diagnosis, huh?
Yeah, I think, like, I would say, in terms of being able to put a finger on it, I think it's something that I've always have pretty much like always like suspected. My uh father had bipolar disorder,
Uh,
and I have like an older sibling who has schizophrenia.
uh,
And as I think, sort of as I was a young adult, I was just aware of the way my, I don't know, like, sort of like brain worked and the way my emotions worked. Basically, I sort of navigated those as a ship on a starless night
mm,
for like a good decade and a half. So I think it was always something that I experienced, but I didn't really have, I don't know, I think like maybe a permission to put a word to it until, it was said like, oh yeah, like this is what you're experiencing.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
particularly if you have people in your family who have such strong diagnoses, like, I mean, there are people who say there's trauma from being in relationships in relation to people who have schizophrenia or bipolar. There's
Yeah.
trauma from that, plus whatever's going on for yourself just internally. Was that your experience?
Oh, that was definitely my experience. My so my middle sister, she and I are very, very close now. So I have two older sisters. They are 13 and 15 years older than me. So
Oh,
they
wow.
were brought up like very close to each other. And by the time I came around, I mean, I sort of related to them like they were, like aunts or something like
So
that.
you're like an only child almost.
Very, very much so. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I think like it was at some point in the last decade or so, in conversations with my the sister that I'm closest to, she I was talking to her, like about depression and anxiety, and she found that the things that I was describing resonated really deeply for her.
Mm.
And I was like, well, of course they do. Because even though we didn't grow up in the same house at the same time, we still grew up in the same house,
Mm.
and that between our dad, and our oldest sister, and then also like having the strong personality of our mother, we like basically we didn't come out unscathed, right? Like we were only aware of their diagnoses, but not did not necessarily at the time like follow it to see like, oh well, then this is the way that our brains sort of compensated,
Yeah.
by sort of giving us the gift of anxiety.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, thanks.
yeah. So it's,
Right.
sort of sort of experience of seeing how, I don't know, yeah, sort of seeing how it's that the trauma has these long arms, and you don't always know sort of like where they end up touching.
Yeah,
But they
yeah.
absolutely do. Yeah.
Yeah, I am investigating my mother's trauma, which I wasn't aware of the depth of until after she died.
Mm,
And then it was like, oh, no wonder she was so glacial and um, so secretive and harsh sometimes. She could be
yeah.
really cruel. And I could see her as a person who suffered with her own mental illness and had been traumatized by her own upbringing to the degree that she became this like citadel, this unapproachable citadel, and how that impacted me and my own psychic health. And in the that's been really great for me because it's lent itself to some forgiveness and some understanding of things that I just was like I really couldn't unpack.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but my relationship with her was complicated, and mothers.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I absolutely can say that I went through a process of discovery like that, like with my own mother. She was my mom was the oldest of, I think it's either eight or nine.
Mm.
I can never remember the number, but it's like, yeah, the oldest of eight and nine. And as that position in the birth order, she basically was responsible for the upbringing and care of her younger siblings, which the next one was just 4 years behind her or something like that, but she was still responsible, for all of them.
Oh,
And
wow.
that is something that like being being responsible for other people was a mantle that was placed on her at a very young age, and it's something that she could never quite investigate for herself and really process.
Yeah.
And I distinctly remember when I was like 20, I was like 21 or 22, and I was on the phone with my mom. She was complaining about something and said something that was just like it was a thing that she had carried from childhood. And I was like, oh shit. One, my mother is a human being. She's a person. She's a
Right.
person who had a childhood, and this is just like a thing that she's been carrying around for now like 50 years. And I think the greatest gift of that moment was that I was able to see that, and then come to this place of like, oh, okay, like this is shit that she hasn't processed. She didn't have the tools to do it. She's just been sort of like making her way through decades and decades and decades of it. I can afford to show her some grace, from this point on,
Yeah.
um, which then resulted in, at the very least, being able to have a good decade and a half of relationship with her before her dementia began. And
Mm-hmm,
then,
mm-hmm.
the process of losing that parent,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
that way.
Right. We
So
share that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I think, like, that there really is something about, as a child of every parent, to be able to see that person, see those people as those individuals, and to see them as either, like, I don't know, like the products of their trauma, or what have you,
Mm-hmm.
as a way of, I think, dismantling the very natural pedestal that we put on them from being their children.
Yeah. Yeah. Or in my case, like I had lived for a very long time believing that my mother was the source of all my problems without taking any responsibility for my own choices or
Yeah.
my own actions, you know, and recognizing that, she had had these experiences was really, it, it broke a lot of that down for me, you
Yeah.
know. You mentioned earlier, you mentioned tendrils, the way that these things, have tendrils that you never know where they're going to touch. Like when they touch places in you, when you're, activated, what is that like? Like what happens for you?
As an adult, once I began to process myself separate, sort of separate from, like, my mother, and in context, with my family and everything. If I could connect how I was because of my upbringing, then the idea is also to do that exponentially, and say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, then, is my mother this way because of her upbringing? Is my dad this way because of this? And then
Yeah.
sort of follow it back.
Right.
And I think what that has, so I also do like a fair amount of like genealogy work.
Oh, do you?
Um,
Okay. That
yeah.
that makes sense that you would speak in terms of like tendrils or,
So in being able to, sort of follow, to use the other metaphor, to sort of follow these branches, sort of like back up. It's like, oh, okay. So, like, what I experienced as a child was an echo of a thing that my parents went through as children, which then was also like another unprocessed thing that, like, my grandparents, experienced. So it's like these tendrils as like history acting on my present.
Okay. Yeah.
It is, whether it is the like the racism they experience, it's the socioeconomic impression that they experience, like the poverty, whatever,
Mm,
all of the different factors that were visited upon them, that they felt very little control in being able to push back on, got basically just got sort of folded into the household, and then passed down in all of these ways.
right. Yeah. As for myself as an artist, my work from the get-go has always been trying to make sense of my childhood. All my work as a visual artist was always about, I was often worked from photos of my family. I was
Mhm.
doing a lot of work around photos of my family, trying to make sense of, I think, for me, probably trying to sort out the gender stuff and trying to make sense of this darkness or whatever you want to call it that I felt that I couldn't identify, isolation and singularity that I felt, trying to make sense. I knew it was somehow connected to my family, and I was trying to explore that. And of course, even now, like I can only write memoir. Like that's all I can write. So I'm always
Yeah.
trying to unpack that stuff. Has it impacted the way that you express yourself as a creative person? Like, does it,
Mm. I,
or is the acting? Is the act of acting itself? Is that the joyful thing? Like, what is it about that?
it's a little bit of both. It's definitely a bit of both. I think
Yeah.
the theme of my childhood and adolescence was feeling misunderstood a lot.
Mhm.
Or actually, no, I'm not even going to say feeling misunderstood, but not feeling understood.
Mhm.
I think as a really specific way.
Yeah, I
Um,
get that.
and I think what that initially did psychologically for me was it created this pressure to like refine my language so that there is as much clarity in speech as I can reach, you know, in order to like make
Yeah.
people understand what it is I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, we talked about this. Yeah. Yeah.
and and I think as a the sort of next level from that is then theater performance acting is the work of making legible interiority, whether it is mine or some character that I'm
Hmm.
playing. That it's all sort of part of struggle to be understood
Yeah.
and to make seen.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's wild. That totally makes sense. I think of both of our the way we are as artists, we need an audience. Like I don't make my art for myself.
Right.
You know,
Right.
we're both, we need an audience. I think I feel that too. I need to be seen and I need to be understood. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's very much a driving force. Yeah. I think it's something about existing in this world and being seen and sort of knowing that people see you in as much clarity as can be found.
Well, and as a black gay man, like there, those are two places where one can be kind of unseen or seen in a way that is, you know, that has nothing to do with oneself. Like
Mhm.
how is that, how does identity impact your, like your depression or your psyche?
Okay, I got.
Yeah, that's a big
Okay,
one.
yeah, because I have a an extremely formative story. Um, and then another one that's also like sort of foundational. But I'm gonna start with like the first one, and I think and it ties like
Okay.
really everything together in a way that sometimes would make me think that I'm a fictional character. Um, and one of the things um, that I like focused on at that time was like use of condoms. And again, this was also so like I was 13, so this was 1991. AIDS is still like
Yeah.
very terrifying and sort of all of these things.
Right. And
So I'm like,
sex ed is very like condom focused. Like that's
yeah,
sex. Yeah.
condom focused at best. Cause like
Okay. Yeah.
when it's
Fair.
not just like straight up abstinence with which is just not even like reality based. So I'm like, okay, let me understand just like what condoms are, you know, like how they're supposed to be used, what is this thing? I asked my dad to take me to the drugstore without telling him what it was for, because I think I was still too like sort of bashful to bring that up. But I was like, oh, like I need to go to car drugs. I just need to pick up some things.
Mm-hmm.
So he took me. He waited in the car. I don't think I told him not to come in, but he just like waited in the car.
Mm-hmm.
I walked into the store. I sort of made my way like sort of anxiously up to the aisle that had the condoms in it, and there were like a larger selection than I was expecting. And I was like, oh,
Uh-huh.
I don't even understand what I'm looking at right now.
Right.
so
Ribbed for her pleasure.
so I I sort of reverse, and then I walk over to like the magazine rack, and I like pick up a magazine. I start flipping through it, but like every now and then I sort of like look over at the condom aisle, and I'm trying to sort of like it's like gin up some more courage. And after a while, another customer, this woman, walks up to me. She had been back in the back at the pharmacy, and she walks up to me, and she was like, she's like, young man, I was in the back of the store, and I just wanted you to know that the folks in the pharmacy were watching you because they weren't really sure what you were here for. That like they thought that you were probably going to be like shoplifting or something. So just giving you a heads up. And then she walked off and made her purchases, and I was like, oh, thank you.
Mm,
So I like grabbed like a TV guide or some magazine or whatever, and then paid for that and left the store.
mm,
And that was what I love about that moment. People see what they sort of want to see, and they sort of see through their own filters. And instead of seeing like this young queer kid who's like, it was a really clear lesson in thinking that people can read my thoughts, and then clearly knowing that they can't.
right.
Right?
Right.
I'm being read in a way that, one, I have no control over, and I think also like I don't think that I have an interest in controlling what they see, but it is very good that I know what they see.
Damn. Yeah. Yeah. Right. For
Right?
safety. And yeah. I really identify with that as a trans guy because it's very, very different, but this feeling of not being seen as the way that I saw myself, or who, really not understanding why people weren't seeing me a certain way,
Yeah.
and having the expectations imposed on me that I should be behaving a certain way or responding a certain way, like a lady or a woman or whatever that was. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think God, like that's a thing. But for you, there's this whole culture, that's built around this, like fuck. And
Yeah.
I know that stuff really impacted me. I mean, that I think was the key to my depression in a lot of ways.
Mm.
That and probably some physical, some sexual abuse I experienced as a kid. I don't know, but um, did that like depress you or make you sad, or was just like picking myself up and moving on?
I think it was mostly picking myself up and moving on, but I think if anything, it made me a little sad for other people.
Yeah,
Like not so much for myself, but it made me a
yeah.
little sad for other people.
Oh, that's so good. I mean, what a great response. If to a horrible thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but there was also something where it was also, and for another reason, like it was also hard for me to internalize that, because like on some level, I think I just immediately connected with the fact that like this was, it couldn't have been more clear that this had nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
Right? Because like if they knew why I walked in that store,
Mm-hmm.
if they actually knew, then like that response the response would have been something different. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what it actually would have been, but it would have been something different. And I think what was really interesting to me was just how much those two things sort of miss the mark of each other.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of my sort of other stories that my family sort of came up in the Baptist church, and that's the spiritual sort of space that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
Although I've never like believed in God, and I've never been like baptized or sort of been a Baptist person, even though I just know all those things from being there. That said, when I was like 5 or 6, so like preschool, first grade ish, I got put into advanced classes, and the school system they call them like the gifted and talented program. And this was also like at church and at home, that was also seen as like a really good thing. Like I was gifted. Like there was all of that language around being gifted.
Mm-hmm.
And once I saw that like the religious community also recognized what the sort of school community saw, and they used this gifted language, I was like, oh, okay. So like when they say gifted, they are speaking about like a gift from God, right? That this intellect is a gift that God gave me.
Uh-huh.
And if that's true, then everything else that I am or that I experience is something that God gave me, and that I am meant to have and not meant to reject or feel negative about or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
So this is me at like
You had
6
that
years old.
thought?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Oh, I mean, because
Because
like no one ever explicitly said any of that to me. I just put it together. I mean, I
mm-hmm.
was also the kid that like at that age, at like 5 or 6, I was asking questions in Sunday school that they told me to stop asking.
Right. I see that kid for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I landed there at a really early age. So then by the time, just a handful of years later, when I began to be aware of sexuality, I was like, oh, like what's this? Like this doesn't seem to match up with like what other boys are saying and everything. And I was like, oh, like maybe this is, just like that gay thing that I, like am hearing about. And I would say there was a brief moment where I might have felt like sort of actual shame about it. But then I was like, oh, wait, no. But if everything that I am is because like that's what God wanted me to have, then like that's that's just it. I'm just going with that.
Yeah.
Right. So like and that, and that was the sort of fuel of that kind of confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which then sort of connects to that moment in the drugstore at 13 where I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, well, like they just misunderstood because they weren't like, I don't know, like they as adults, they weren't willing to ask actual questions.
Yeah.
They were looking at like a 13-year-old kid and sort of projecting their own stuff.
Whereas you had been
So
liberated at 5.
yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, this isn't my stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm just sort of moving through it.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah. So that's why it made me sort of like sad for them, but it wasn't like, yeah, like this isn't
Uh-huh.
mine.
Right. That's so wild. Yeah, I didn't get that. Why I was raised by atheists, so I never got that. Like you're perfect
Mm,
and you were made perfectly in God's image or whatever. Yeah, I mean that's such a powerful message, whether you're religious or not. It's like, oh yeah, this is me. Like
yeah, I
I'm
mean,
the perfect me.
yes, you're yeah, you are always the perfect you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also like there's a strange contradiction in the fact that like I can say this, and at the same time I have never firmly believed in God.
Right. I get it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So here's a child who has, sounds like, a lot of coping mechanisms, a strong and healthy ego and sense of himself. What brought you, or what was the darkness or depression? Like, what brought you to that? Or what was that experience? Did that come as an adult, or?
I think it definitely I would say it definitely came as an more as an adult, and maybe like late childhood. Um, I mean, I think you're aware that like the sort of major loss, the trauma that I experienced as a teenager was the death of my father when I was 15, and he died at home. I was right there with him on the porch, when
Right.
he took his last breath. And what I remember in that moment or in that evening was when the paramedics had him on the stretcher and loaded him into the loaded him into the ambulance. I experienced that moment, and I'm remembering the line from Every Brilliant Thing of a loved one becoming an object,
Mm,
right? And I remember a thing that I don't know, that my brain, that my perception did was in processing that. I had an out of body experience. I
uh-huh.
felt like I I felt like I lifted up out of my body, floated above the city, above the planet, out of our solar system, um, and I reached a point where I then saw like the entire cosmos just sort of laid out, and
Wow.
then zoomed back into my body.
Whoa.
From my sort of emotional memory, what I felt was that, oh, I have just been shown like the underworkings and the architecture of like reality. Like this is how the universe works. Like
Mm,
there's life, there's the end of life, there's passing on, there's all these things, like, and this was a pivotal moment of like pulling back the curtain and then closing it back again.
whoa.
Right now, from a physiological standpoint, it was a trauma experience of just like, oh, this is the most significant loss I have experienced to this point in time.
Mm,
And it was just, brain, like just everything in the brain sort of
neurons
firing.
firing.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. And I think that I don't think that is necessarily origin story, but I think it is definitely like sort of very much a formative moment, um, because I'd always been a kid who enjoyed spending time like by myself and just sort of playing in my room and doing that sort of thing,
Hmm.
not needing the attention of like other people in the house or everything. I've always just been kind of like fine by myself.
Yeah.
Um, into adulthood, I saw how that sort of was scaffolding for not always having like a lot of strong connections to other people,
Hmm.
and the ways in which depression can take some advantage of that, right? Just because
Hmm.
there's not a lot of that, but like there's no sort of social bolstering.
You're already isolated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
already isolated, and then yeah, and then brain chemistry is just gonna be able to sort of run at full speed
Yeah.
without like anybody saying, "Oh, wait, no, that's probably not true."
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think all of those things, sort of contribute to it, even though I don't necessarily believe that any one thing is like the cause of it. Like, I mean,
Right.
it's
Right.
it's just body chemistry. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. It's what
yeah,
we got.
yeah, is what we got.
Yeah. So that begs the question, Thaddeus, why live?
For me, it's also because as far as I know, this is the only life that I will live.
Mm-hmm.
And I am curious about what happens tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
I've only experienced one moment of suicidal ideation. That was when I was a teenager. And it was for the most fucking teenager reason ever. Like, and I know that like even the despair, the moments of despair that I have experienced like as an adult, um, just with every with everything that I've experienced, there
Mm-hmm.
like I'm still just like I want to know what happens tomorrow. Like
Mm-hmm.
I want to see tomorrow, or just today. Today is never the end.
Mm-hmm.
There is always a tomorrow until tomorrow doesn't come,
Right.
right? But I also know that like I have not experienced the tomorrow that doesn't come yet.
Yeah, yes, right. There came a time that was precipitated by Trump's election where I began to lose my faith in humanity. And I started to think, well, maybe there's not goodness, or maybe there's
Mm,
a lot of badness that I don't want to live with anymore. Like
yeah.
I really had this thought, like, I don't know that I want to be in a world with these awful people. How did you handle that?
That's reminding me of a thought I had. I think it was in like no, high school, and I think we were doing we must have been doing like a segment on like Anne Frank, or it's like around the Holocaust or something. And I remember at the time thinking about the centuries of slavery, thinking about the Holocaust. And I feel like at some point, maybe I don't know, maybe like a teacher or someone floated this idea of like Adolf Hitler being like the most evil human being to have ever existed. And I was like, nah, I mean, pretty fucking
Pretty
bad.
bad.
But like not the worst. And the capacity for the impact of evil was great. But then you also have like on the flip side, you've got I think at the time I was also thinking, well, like what about like Mother Teresa? Like it like so then is she not like a sign of like the capacity of good for people? And just seeing humans as having the capacity for evil and good.
Mm-hmm.
And that not I think seeing historical events and significant figures in human history as like the parameters for what is capable for what humanity is capable of doing.
Mm-hmm.
There was slavery before the transatlantic slave trade. Like that's what like that latest one is the one that impacts my life the most.
Mm-hmm.
um but like they also talk about like slaves in the Bible. Like there's slavery like sort of everywhere. But then there were also like good people everywhere and at all points in history. So I think that was something that showed human beings as having capacity for good and evil,
Mm-hmm.
and that it was not something that was tied to a point in time,
Right.
right? That humans have always been capable of atrocious evil.
Yeah.
Humans have always been capable of just the most wondrous good and grace,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that's yeah. So those are two things for me. I think the other thing is that I was always aware through church of an apocalyptic worldview that I would say that certain sects of Christianity has and sort of always has.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Baptist church, I thought that we had an apocalyptic worldview, because they're always talking about like what is it like the rapture, and the rapture is always there's always a sign that like something's going to happen and it's going to be the end of days, and whether it's barcodes on products, or now it's social security numbers. Oh, there's always a new thing that is
Mm-hmm.
supposed to have been the sign of the devil, and that brings on, that's supposed to be the end of days. And I'm like, but there have been these signs for like the last 100 years. So like,
Mm-hmm.
when is it gonna be? Because like
Right.
each time you say it, you're always wrong.
Right.
So if it wasn't that thing 5 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 50 years ago, it probably isn't the thing today.
Right.
You know?
Right. Or that story with all the blow up sex dolls that escaped the did you hear that?
I don't know that.
Oh, yeah, there's this apocryphal story about a bunch of helium filled sex dolls that were released, and this mother and her thought she thought it was the end of days. She saw these
That's
sex dolls
amazing.
floating up in the air. I don't know if it's true, but I love the image of it. It's the end of
It's the
days.
end of days. And then that would be like, it was like, oh well, I guess they got chosen, and I clearly didn't if I'm standing
Yeah,
on
I didn't make the cut. Well, back to this idea of curiosity.
Mhm.
Even though I had lost my love of humanity, I still was curious about the next day. I wanted to die, mind you. I still felt like suicidal, but I really am driven by curiosity. I think that's just what motivates me and moves me. Sounds like it's what gets to you too. As we're talking, like I'm been touching on these kind of difficult moments with you, and I haven't seen you break or get really emotional about any of this stuff. It's all been like you've worked through it, or you seem to, you know,
Yeah.
whatever. You've approached it very sort of intellectually. Is that kind of your armor, or is that your way, or what would you say?
I think it's definitely a bit of both. Yeah, it is at times, armor. Um, but it is, yeah, just like also like the way that I process, just by thinking and overthinking, and then feeling too much, and then being aware of like, oh wow, like I felt like really really strongly about that thing. So what does that mean? And then that, like
Oh,
then there's more
generates a
thinking.
new, uh,
Yeah,
awesome.
I think, like, I mean, there's also, I don't know, like I feel, what's the movie? Is it Inside Out? It's that Disney movie. It's the Pixar movie that takes place in the mind of a
Oh,
young
when
girl.
the senses are all the
Yeah, and it's
yeah,
like, yeah,
yeah.
like all of her, like her emotions, everything, and
Mm-hmm.
and they're dealing with uncomplicated emotions until she's like 14 or 15, and that's when, they start to do those things. What I connect to there is, I don't feel like I have a lot of memories or feelings that are just one thing, right? Like that are just bad, or just dark, or just, like sort of weighty. Like there's always, it might be bad, but then there was like something funny that happened.
Yeah,
Like, so
yeah.
so it's complicated by being sort of mindful, about all of these different things.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That's a great coping mechanism, if that's what it is. I mean, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is. I mean, like part of it is sort of being in my head a lot, but I'm also like sort of deeply emotional, but not like all the time.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. What's going on in your life now? Like, do you have any projects that are happening, or?
I haven't decided to do any like in-person performing again, because while I loved the story and a lot of things about the experience of doing Every Brilliant Thing, it was just like a stressful time in the world to try to
Yeah,
perform live.
yeah.
And that decision was made, so much of that decision was made before Delta variant, that we then
Ah,
had to sort of quickly figure out like how we were still going to do things.
and now with this Omicron, it's like, Oh, COVID, it's in my toothbrush. Oh, COVID, it's
Yeah,
in my drinking water. Oh, COVID. Yeah.
yeah. I don't know. I think I'm just trying to like sort of take, for the most part, like take things like day by day, but also what this last nearly 2 years has led me to be is in a place where I just have to be okay with not performing for a significant amount of time.
Hmm.
So it sucks, but then at the same time, I've done a handful of like Zoom readings, and it's not, it just doesn't do it for me.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I'd rather I will wait until the day comes that we feel comfortable being in theaters together, like in a way that we recognize again.
Yes. Right. Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just so fucked up and scary right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
finally, what words of hope would you offer people?
Cultivate curiosity. I think that was a bit of advice that I got in actually in like couples counseling years and years ago. And it was a thing that at the time allowed a way back in, at that relationship, but then also thinking about the ways in which that can be repurposed in all of these different ways. I
Mhm.
think one of the things that we, as we get older, it can be very easy to lose sight of curiosity, to just be less curious, right? Because
Mhm.
like we already know things and we've
Yeah.
already
Been
experienced
there. Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But like the world opens up the more curious that you can be, and there's always like there's always something new if you can be curious enough to, yeah, to look for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. That is
Yeah.
great stuff. Thank you so much, Thaddeus. I really appreciate you
Oh,
um,
thank you, Sam. I
talking with me
really enjoyed
today.
getting to do this.